กฤตการณ์ทางการเมืองที่เกิดขึ้นในหลายประเทศเป็นสัญญาณที่บ่งบอกถึงความเชื่อมั่นในระบอบประชาธิปไตยที่ลดลงประชาชนส่วนใหญ่เกิดความรู้สึกว่าตนเองไม่ได้มีส่วนร่วมทางการเมืองมากพอรวมถึงความเหลื่อมล้ำในสังคมที่ทำให้หลายครั้งเสียงของประชาชนถูกมองข้ามเช่นเดียวกับสังคมไทยในบริบทของโลกที่มีการพัฒนาอย่างไร้ขีดจำกัดเทคโนโลยีการสื่อสารเปิดโอกาสให้คนทุกกลุ่มสามารถเข้าถึงข่าวสารในเวลาอันรวดเร็วเกิดสังคมที่มีความสลับซับซ้อนมากขึ้นความหลากหลายของผู้คนและปัญหาความเหลื่อมล้ำทางสังคมสิ่งเหล่านี้มาพร้อมกับปัญหาทางสังคมมากมายเกิดเป็นหลายปัจจัยที่ทำให้ระบอบประชาธิปไตยไทยหยุดชะงักเมื่อกลไกต่างๆไม่สามารถก้าวทันความเปลี่ยนแปลงของโลกได้อย่างทันท่วงทีนี่คือความท้าทายแห่งยุคสมัยที่ประชาชนทุกคนสมควรมีส่วนร่วมในการพัฒนาระบอบประชาธิปไตยเพื่อรองรับสภาพสังคมที่เปลี่ยนไปใช้เทคโนโลยีการสื่อสารอันทันสมัยสร้างระบบการตรวจสอบอันเข้มแข็งเข้าถึงการมีส่วนร่วมทางการเมืองในทุกมิติเพราะประชาธิปไตยไม่ได้เป็นเพียงระบอบการปกครองแต่เป็นกลไกสำคัญที่แสดงให้เห็นว่าประชาชนทุกคนคือเจ้าของประเทศร่วมกันมาวันนี้วันที่ประเทศไทยอยู่ในช่วงเวลาของการปฏิรูปทางการเมืองบนพื้นฐานของระบอบประชาธิปไตยอันมีพระมหากษัตริย์ทรงเป็นประมุขจึงเป็นโอกาสดีที่คนไทยทุกคนจะได้เก็บความผิดพลาดที่ผ่านมาไว้เป็นบทเรียนร่วมกันสร้างพัฒนาสถาบันกลไกและกระบวนการทางการเมืองต่างๆของประเทศไทยให้เป็นประชาธิปไตยที่มีจิตวิญญาณมีภูมิคุ้มกันและมีชีวิตชีวาขึ้นใหม่อีกครั้งสถาบันพระปกเกล้าในฐานะสถาบันทางวิชาการที่มีภารกิจสำคัญในการพัฒนาประชาธิปไตยธรรมาภิบาลและสันติวิธีตระหนักในคุณค่าของการเปิดโอกาสให้ทุกภาคส่วนประชาชนทุกคนมีส่วนร่วมในการกำหนดทิศทางของประเทศเพื่อประโยชน์สุขของประชาชนและเสริมสร้างประชาธิปไตยไทยให้กลับมาสดใสมีจิตวิญญาณขึ้นอีกครั้งจึงได้จัดให้มีการประชุมวิชาการสถาบันพระปกเกล้าครั้งที่ 18 ประจำปีพุทธศักราช 2559 ในหัวข้อเติมชีวิตคืนชีวาประชาธิปไตยพบกับกิจกรรมการประชุม 5 กลุ่มย่อยที่จะนำไปสู่การพลิกฟื้นคืนศรัทธาที่มีต่อระบอบประชาธิปไตยประชาธิปไตยไซเบอร์ความเปลี่ยนแปลงด้านเทคโนโลยีเกิดขึ้นอย่างรวดเร็วจนวันนี้เราไม่สามารถปฏิเสธเทคโนโลยีได้มีความพยายามในการนำระบบเทคโนโลยีมาใช้เพื่อให้ประชาชนเข้าถึงข้อมูลและการบริการได้อย่างสะดวกประชาธิปไตยไซเบอร์มีส่วนสำคัญในการทำให้ประชาชนสามารถแสดงออกซึ่งการมีสิทธิเสรีภาพของตนเองได้อย่างเป็นรูปธรรมและมีความหมายส่งผลให้ประชาธิปไตยในหลายพื้นที่มีชีวิตชีวาและคุณภาพมากขึ้นรัฐบาลแบบเปิดรัฐบาลแบบเปิดมีเป้าหมายเพื่อให้ประชาชนได้รับการบริการที่มีคุณภาพดังนั้นจึงมีการพัฒนาการบริการสาธารณะให้รวดเร็วทั่วถึงโปร่งใสและเป็นธรรมสร้างระบบการสื่อสารระหว่างภาครัฐกับประชาชนนำนวัตกรรมและเทคโนโลยีที่ทันสมัยมาใช้เพื่อให้ประชาชนสามารถเข้าถึงข้อมูลข่าวสารรัฐบาลแบบเปิดจะช่วยพลิกฟื้นประชาธิปไตยไทยให้มีดุลยภาพและเกิดความยั่งยืนอย่างแท้จริงพลเมืองฟื้นชีวาประชาธิปไตยร่วมกันสร้างสังคมประชาธิปไตยที่เปิดโอกาสให้คนทุกภาคส่วนได้มีส่วนร่วมและเป็นเจ้าของอำนาจในการปกครองประเทศอย่างแท้จริงเพราะนับแต่นี้ไปประชาชนทุกคนมีสิทธิ์ที่จะร่วมในระบบงานอาสาช่วยทำให้สังคมประชาธิปไตยเป็นสังคมที่เอื้ออาทรภาคธุรกิจเพื่อสังคมต้องเกื้อกูลกับสาธารณะชุมชนต้องมีทิศทางการพัฒนาบนฐานของวิถีวัฒนธรรมและวิถีชุมชนของตนเองอันเป็นพื้นฐานของการมีส่วนร่วมในการพัฒนาประชาธิปไตยประชาธิปไตยแบบปรึกษาหารือการปรึกษาหารือสาธารณะเป็นเครื่องมือสำคัญของกระบวนการซึ่งนำไปสู่การตัดสินใจเชิงนโยบายเป็นการสร้างฉันทามติทางสังคมผ่านการตกลงร่วมกันด้วยเหตุและผล โดยเปิดโอกาสให้ประชาชนทุกสถานะทุกชนชั้นได้มีพื้นที่ในการแสดงความคิดเห็นเพื่อนำไปสู่จุดร่วมที่ทุกคนพึงพอใจและยอมรับได้ร่วมกันการเมืองไม่ได้เป็นพื้นที่ของนักการเมืองหรือผู้มีอำนาจเท่านั้นดังนั้นการเมืองต้องเป็นพื้นที่ที่ต้องรองรับความหลากหลายบนพื้นฐานสิทธิมนุษยชนศักดิ์ศรีความเป็นมนุษย์ต้องเปิดพื้นที่ให้ทุกภาคส่วนทุกชาติพันธุ์ทุกเพศทุกวัยและทุกศาสนาอย่างเท่าเทียมโปร่งใสและเป็นธรรมวันนี้ไม่เพียงแต่ภาครัฐที่มีบทบาทในการปฏิรูปการเมืองเท่านั้นภาคเอกชนและภาคพลเมืองก็เป็นกลไกสำคัญที่จะเติมชีวิตคืนชีวาให้แก่ประชาธิปไตยไทยเพื่อเป็นพลังขับเคลื่อนไปสู่สังคมที่มีความเข้มแข็งและเติบโตได้อย่างยั่งยืน
ครับขอบพระคุณนะครับทุกท่านก็คงจะได้ประมวลเหตุการณ์นะครับทางการเมืองต่างๆนะครับผ่านการชมวิดีทัศน์เติมชีวิตคืนชีวาประชาธิปไตยไปเมื่อสักครู่นี้ได้พอสมควรแล้วนะครับลำดับต่อไปจะเป็นการแสดงปาฐกถานำในหัวข้อเรื่อง Democracy Reimagine โดยมิสเตอร์เดวิดคิงอดีตรัฐมนตรีว่าการกระทรวงศึกษาธิการจากรัฐอัลเบอร์ตาประเทศแคนาดาครับในโอกาสนี้ครับผมขอกราบเรียนเชิญท่านดร.ชิงชัยหานเจนลักษณ์ประธานคณะกรรมการจัดงานประชุมวิชาการสถาบันพระปกเกล้าครั้งที่ 18 ให้เกียรติแนะนำประวัติผู้แสดงปาฐกถานำครับขอกราบเรียนเชิญครับ
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, dear participants, it is my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, David King, whom I met for the first time over 30 years ago. David King is what we can call a citizen politician, having spent 17 years in the Alberta Legislative Building and another 20 years working for a locally elected politician in the province. He is the former and first executive director of the Public School Board Association of Alberta. As Minister of Education, David King was responsible for a number of major initiatives, including the establishment of provincial diploma examinations and provincial achievement tests, the educational management finance plan, among other things. In the year 2010, he was recognized by the Alberta Teachers Association and then by the Canadian Teachers Federation as a friend of education. It is my great honor now to give you David King. Please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me at the back of the room? I would like to begin by extending my thanks to King Prajatipak's Institute for inviting me to speak to a distinguished audience about a topic that has occupied my mind and work for more than 50 years. I acknowledge with humility the presence of Her Royal Highness the Princess and others whose contribution to the trajectory of democracy is more significant than my own. I also wish to extend my condolences to His Royal Highness the Crown Prince and Her Royal Highness the Princess and all the people of Thailand on the loss of King Bhumibol. His reign was long and eventful for the people of Thailand. His death has struck so many Thais in a very personal way. The royal family and the people of Thailand are in my prayers for strength as they grieve. I have been asked to speak to you this afternoon about reimagining democracy. And in the course of that, we must first acknowledge our constraints, and we need then to free ourselves from unnecessary shackles. I will try to do both these things before speaking about what I consider to be some of the essentials of democracy. My contention will be that democracy is an aspiration we never achieve to our satisfaction. In fact, we should never be satisfied with our efforts toward democracy if democracy is our inclination. I will define democracy for the purposes of my remarks this afternoon as the attempt by a community to bring a specific ideal into practice, the ideal of government by and for the people. The people do this, in my experience, in order to achieve four primary conditions. First, they want freedom from tyranny and from being a tyrant. Second, they want harmony. Third, they want the rule of law. And fourth, they want natural equality. In order to achieve and maintain these conditions, the people of a community must exercise what I might call citizen wisdom and then reasoning without knowledge. And they do this based on an education that includes preparation for life as a good citizen of the community. This characterization of democracy depends upon some additional elements that I would like to raise and advocate for your consideration. In my experience, a democracy needs to recognize and nurture concentric circles of community. It needs to value the local. It needs to recognize the existence and fundamental importance of something that I would call the public. It needs to recognize and nurture inclusion and diversity and trust. A democracy needs to acknowledge a preference for a civil society, active citizenship, effective leadership, and discerning followership. It needs to understand the fundamental importance of, and it needs to nurture public education. And a democracy needs to recognize, nurture, and celebrate the practice of politics. Citizens then will be equipped, included, and engaged, even in difficult conversations. There will be a preference for the local. There will be a proliferation of social good organizations of every kind. Citizens will experience both leadership and followership in a variety of settings. There will be government by and for the people. Let me state plainly some of the constraints on my remarks to you this afternoon beginning with the personal constraints. As the introduction makes clear, I am from North America. It bears adding that I am not familiar with South Asia. In addition, I am an English-speaking Canadian, not an American. So my direct experience is with our peculiar strain of a constitutional monarchy and the British parliamentary system and the English language media and academic work. I speak to you from a Euro-American experience. Perhaps my peculiar contribution to the work of this Congress will be that I offer you a different perspective. As the people of Canada's easternmost province would say, I come from away. A second personal constraint that may be less obvious to you at this moment, but perhaps it will be plain by the time I have finished speaking, is that I am not an academic, let alone an expert. I am a Democrat, a sometimes politician with a bias for the local, and I am a lifelong student. I enjoy my intellect, and I try to exercise it regularly and strenuously, but you will see this afternoon that it remains wild and undisciplined to this day. I was not invited with the expectation that I would speak to you with certainty. I was invited to open some doors to new questions about democracy and new avenues of exploration. So it bears saying that one of the important reasons I was delighted to accept the invitation to speak is that I expect to learn much from you over the course of the next 2 days. My life's experience, including my interactions with others, as well as my reading and reflecting, introduce 4 more constraints that I must take a few moments to present to you. I often quote the last president of Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel, who said, and I quote, "Today, many things indicate that we are going through a transitional period when it seems that something is on the way out and something else is painfully being born. It is as if something is crumbling, decaying, and exhausting itself, while something else, still indistinct, is rising from the rubble." End quote. Like mine, Havel's experience was Euro-American, primarily European. So he may have been speaking about the reality that all the rule systems and many of the institutions that a dominant Euro-American culture has relied upon for 100 years or more are in a shambles, and they are often not trusted by citizens. No matter where we are in the world, no matter which community we inhabit, when our rule systems and institutions break down, it means that the underlying metaphor or model or story is no longer working for us. And at least in Euro-American culture, virtually all our systems and institutions are breaking down. Something new must be invented. We can't live without just and dynamic rules, so we try to foresee and understand the emerging model and develop rules that conform to the emerging model. In this context, it is timely to reimagine democracy. As a prelude to reimagination, we should try to strip away what has accumulated over time as though it is essential or necessary to democracy when it may in fact be neither essential nor even an attractive accessory. As a Euro-American, liberalism has been closely aligned with my understanding of democracy, and for many years I accepted that democracy required a liberal view of the world. I have what may be an unusual take on liberalism. I have always understood liberalism to have four fundamental tenets. One, liberalism espouses the absolute primacy and autonomy of the individual. Two, liberalism values rationality, objectivity, and the so-called scientific method to the exclusion of all other ways of knowing. Three, liberalism reflects Newtonian mechanics and science and seeks to impose mechanistic models on human systems. And fourth, liberalism espouses an inexorable march to ultimate perfection, at which point, presumably, dynamism will cease to exist and the universe will enjoy an infinity of fixedness. I don't want to be misunderstood as I comment on liberalism. For 150 years, it contributed in significant ways to social development in Euro-America. But as is always the case, its enthusiastic proponents have, from the beginning, neglected or belittled its limitations and its shortcomings. And over time, liberalism suffers from a lack of re-examination. It has become overdominant and unchecked. The good in liberalism needs to be liberated from liberalism itself and recast inside a new metaphor and model. The problem, as I see it, is that liberalism no longer corresponds to what we know or intuit about the nature of the world and about the nature of us as humans. In my view, liberalism is close to the end of a death march. It will not be able to survive the death of the mechanistic scientific model from which it emerged. As Havel said, it is as if something is crumbling, decaying, and exhausting itself, while something else, still indistinct, is rising from the rubble. We can begin to see in now well-established new scientific fields, such as quantum physics, genetics, and neurology, as well as in ancient ways of knowing, the vague outlines of a social theory that might emerge. We who have grown up breathing the air of liberalism are thinking more organically and less mechanically, more chaotically and less hierarchically, more adaptively and less rigidly, more relationally and less individually. At the same time, there is order, because creation needs order, down to the atom or the village. So on the one hand, the future is beginning to collapse in on us in ways humanity has not experienced in 2,500 years. On the other hand, there is an inclination toward information and order. We will modify our dominant stories over time to fit our emerging understandings. Old stories and dominant institutions will be edited, revised, and sometimes replaced. Democracy is not necessarily tied to liberalism. Democracy will be able to survive and thrive if we rethink it. This is one of the reasons that you in this audience have an opportunity to reimagine democracy. Let me then say a few words about sovereignty. Sovereignty is a concept that looms large in Western political thought, organization, and activity. Sovereignty in modern Euro-American thought is generally traced back to the European Peace of Westphalia in 1648. In Euro-American thought, sovereignty has, from its beginnings, been a reflection of the liberal idea that the individual is sovereign and has a preferential right to be what I will call a unilateralist, the autonomous individual with a moral right to act more or less as she or he chooses. In the Euro-American experience, the question has been, how can we reconcile the idea of the sovereign individual with the concept of the sovereign nation? And from this question has flowed the idea of the social contract, the Euro-American idea that the sovereignty of nations is the result of every citizen having entered into a contract with the state by which they cede their sovereignty to the state, and the state in response undertakes to protect them. This, I believe, is an idea that needs to be reconsidered. And given what I think about democracy, the idea is unsatisfactory to me. I do not believe that people, whether as citizens or otherwise, are primarily or solely individual, atomistic, isolated, and unilateralists. We are individuals, certainly, and our individuality needs to be valued and respected. But that individuality does not exist except in tandem with the equally powerful idea that we are also relational. We are social beings, not isolationists. The ground of our being as citizens is not some isolated state. It is also equally moral responsibility to others and social cohesion. Personally, I would enlarge the idea of sovereignty and give it a somewhat different direction, and I take comfort in this effort from the story of constitutional monarchies, and I'll speak to my experience as a Canadian. Basically, the concept of domestic sovereignty needs to be reconsidered in relation to at least two questions. Question number one, what are the essential characteristics of sovereignty? And question number two, where is sovereignty embodied? I would argue that the essential characteristics of sovereignty are these. First, it represents the ultimate social cohesion of the community. The reach of sovereignty reveals the outer boundaries of the community that is a nation. Second, sovereignty represents the ultimate check on the government of the state, and I distinguish the state from the nation. And third, sovereignty transcends any individual and demonstrates the deeply relational nature of our life. I would argue that constitutional monarchies are, so far, a big step ahead of republics. It may be an accident of history, but however it has happened, I would argue that the constitutional monarchy contains the seeds of genius, because it treats sovereignty as something that is communitarian rather than individual, and it also treats sovereignty as something that is greater than and apart from government and the state. Most important, in a constitutional monarchy, such as the one I am familiar with, sovereignty is embodied in a person who is also a crucial social institution, the Crown, and a social institution that is independent of government or the state. In a constitutional monarchy, the Crown predates the government, is more or less independent of the government, and transcends the government. The Queen of Canada can constrain the government of Canada. I don't know of any republic that is structured to embody sovereignty in an institution that is honored apart from the government, with the capacity, even though that may be infrequently exercised, to overrule the government. I am confident that such an institution could be invented for a republic, but I am not aware that the invention has happened yet. A constitutional monarch, in my experience, is one who has abandoned absolutism and adopted an orientation toward the people and an attitude of servant leadership. In the Euro-American experience, the constitutional monarch has given over government to others, but has retained the essence of national life, sovereignty, which transcends government and is, I would argue, the ultimate protection of the people. And I might say, as an aside that I very much appreciate some drinking water. I might say as another aside that most citizens in many constitutional monarchies, perhaps in republics as well, might wish that bureaucrats had as deep a sense of public service as the monarch usually has. The disadvantage so far of the Republican model is that it grants sovereignty to the government and gives up any claim that there is an ultimate control over the government that is independent of government. Internally, something that we currently call sovereignty is the glue that binds a nation together. This is a valuable building block for a powerful democracy, and I would suggest to you that we should explore the idea of sovereignty with a very imaginative turn of mind. Competition, and often a corresponding adversarial attitude, is also a much discussed feature of many conversations about democracy. I do not believe that competition is inherent in and central to the nature of humanity. I accept that competition is deeply embedded in our psyche and in our culture, but I don't accept that cultural embeddedness is the same thing as being inherent in human nature. I am very skeptical about any assertion that competition is inherent in and essential to any of our political processes. Animals have characteristics that we do not necessarily attribute to humans simply because the characteristics are part of the nature of animals. Children display characteristics that we try to wean them from rather than accept that the characteristics would be a desirable part of their adult life. Neither reality of competition in nature or in children obliges us to value or rely on competition in the adult world. To go further, I would argue that competition is a toxic characteristic for us as individuals, for our future generally, and for democracy. So I don't believe that competition is a good ingredient for the development of social or political systems, and I argue that the evolution of democracy will flow away from competitive, adversarial, and mechanistic systems that treat power as a zero-sum game. The evolution of democracy will flow toward generative, collaborative, and organic systems that treat power as cumulative. Associated with the idea of competition is the idea of having power over. Like the lack of competition itself, the idea of power being a zero-sum game, the idea of having power over, is an idea in retreat. The future of power lies in the term power with, rather than power over. The primacy of the political sphere is the last thing about which I want to make a comment before turning directly into the question of democracy itself. I believe in the primacy of the political sphere. The political system in any nation, in any community, is the foundational system, and others, such as the economic system, are and must be subsidiary to the political system. Any other purported relationship is, in my view, delusional and only very temporary. To digress for a moment, I remain a believer in the market economy as long as it is rule-governed. I do not, however, believe in capitalism, which is to me a perversion of the rule-based market economy. When I walk the streets of Bangkok and see hundreds of small shops side by side, I cannot imagine that their economic system could be any further away from Wall Street and Bear Stearns than we experience from day to day now. The rise of plutocrats is not a welcome development for those of us who believe in democracy. Because of the current inversion, corporations and the super wealthy enjoy privileges that they should not enjoy, and capitalism operates as a legitimate economic system when, as I have said, it is a corruption of the idea of a rule-based market system. Most significantly, the current inversion in which the economic paradigm appears to be predominant and the political paradigm appears to be subordinate will only be temporary, I assure you. The inversion must necessarily be brief, increasingly unhappy, and then toxic and abrupt in the ending of it. So, I have turned my back on some elements of classical liberalism, competition, the primacy of the economic. I have urged that we build on the idea of sovereignty, beginning where we find the constitutional monarch, independent of government, transcending government, and manifesting the solidarity of the people. I now turn directly to democracy. I'd like to begin by referring to a book called First Democracy by a classicist named Paul Woodruff. Woodruff argued that a democracy is a community that tries, and I am quoting, to bring a specific ideal into practice, the ideal of government by and for the people, end quote. Woodruff focused on ancient Athens and wrote about a time and place in which people aspired to create and maintain 4 conditions that they considered worthy, important, and desirable. The first thing that the Athenians sought was freedom from tyranny and from being a tyrant. The second was harmony within the community. The third was the rule of law. And the fourth was natural equality. Woodruff argues that in pursuit of these 4 conditions, Athenians pursued what he called citizen wisdom, dialoguing together, thinking about their problems, and reasoning without knowledge, We cannot know for certain what will be the condition of our community a year or 5 years from now. We need to reason without knowledge. And this, he said, had to be based on an effective preparation for life as a good citizen of the community. Another way of saying this is to say that the goal of democracy is to optimize personal creative space in such a way that everyone benefits. In a democracy, each person and each community should be constantly asking these questions about their political being. Can we author? Can we create our own story of significance for our own community? Second, can we move? Can we do the things that are necessary to bring our story to life? And third, can we exert some meaningful control over the way we bring our story to life? In the balance of my presentation, I want to focus on understanding democracy in terms of our local and social life. Only when we understand it in those terms can we begin to consider form of government and formal political relationships and action. Given my life's experience, I would like to add some details that I believe are inherent in Woodruff's description. The first detail I would add is one that Woodruff took as given because he was writing about Athens. Community. A democracy needs a people and a place, what we might call today a community or a nation. Since social reality is considerably more complex today than it was 2,500 years ago, the truth is that each and every one of us now lives simultaneously in a number of communities, from the small to the very large. For example, when I reflect on my own life, I think of myself as living in 8 communities, from my neighborhood in a city in a Canadian province through to my being a citizen of the world. The secret is to discern how many layers of community are vital to citizens within the reach of their sovereignty, and then what kind of self-government is most meaningful for each layer. Place is important to understanding community. In my experience, place shapes our history, our culture, and our community. And place, like people, should be respected when we consider democracy and government. So I believe that a community is the embodiment of people and place together. I find it revealing that 2,500 years ago, in the language of the Greek area, people speaking in their own language would not have said, "I am going to Athens." They would have said, "I am going to the Athenians." It's interesting that in 1939, this country changed its name from Siam to Thailand. Okay? I am not coming to a place alone. I am coming to the people who inhabit the place. I am coming not so much to Thailand as I am coming to the Thais. Living simultaneously within a number of nested communities and believing that strong communities have a strong sense of the local, I have a bias for the local. I have lived most of my life in a province where forestry is important. I learned very early that the circumference of the tree is no indication of its health or its ability to withstand a windstorm. If the heart of the tree is rotten, the tree can fall in a windstorm regardless of the circumference of the trunk. It is vital to acknowledge that we live simultaneously in a number of entwined communities, and wisdom dictates that we should promote some measure of self-government in each community, particularly in the local community. It is there that we learn our first lessons about self-government. You cannot say that the tree needs no strong heart and no healthy trunk, but even so the bark will do well and the tree will withstand severe storms. We are strong from the inside out, not from the outside in. It is also important to distinguish decentralized government from dispersed government. Superficially, they may appear to be the same, but they are not. A highly centralized government may disperse its bureaucrats to many different places to do their work locally, but if those bureaucrats take their orders from the center, they are working and the citizens are living within a dispersed, but even so centralized system of government. A decentralized system is one in which there is local self-government, local creation of the story, local putting together the means of making the story real. Some decisions are made locally by people who are elected locally, and the local government has the resources to hire people and find the material necessary to implement their decisions. As a Democrat, I believe that in any of my communities, my neighbors and I should have a mandate and be capable and assertive of some measure of local self-government. The decision-making process in each community is always a combination of informal and formal processes and more or less autonomy. In the smaller community, the decision-making process tends toward the informal, and in the larger community, it tends toward the formal. Whether formal or informal, the decision-making process may or may not be democratic. It may or may not be friendly to citizens. These days, practical politicians must find a way of layering democratic government so that there are appropriate means and tools of self-government in small communities, intermediate communities, and ultimately the large community, which is the nation. It is important that local and regional governments be treated with respect by the national government. There are two important matters to establish for local and regional governments. One is a clear mandate. What is to be done locally or regionally? The second is access for each kind of government to necessary finances with an assurance of stability over time. In Canada, we refer to this as the revenue sharing challenge. I've described community as a people and a place. The second addition I would make to Woodruff's description is that the people are not simply an aggregation of individuals. In a community that is doing well, whether it is a village or a nation, there is a strong sense of cohesion. The people together are greater than the sum of the parts. This is the public. We are all familiar with the story of the bundle of sticks that is stronger and more difficult to break when they are bound together than if we break each of the sticks one at a time. The public is something mysterious that is greater than the sum of its parts. And Thailand, at this very moment, is a good example of what I am trying to convey. It is not only individual ties who mourn the death of the king. There is a clear and strong sense that ties as a people are mourning the death together, and we can feel the mourning of the nation, the public, taking us beyond the sense of individuals being in mourning. This is an illustration of the people. Democracy, and probably any form of government other than a tyranny, is impossible without a strong sense that citizens have that we are all in this together. And they need as well a strong sense of what this is. When we say that we are all in this together, what are we talking about? There must be a sense of cohesion among the people around common stories from the past, dreams of the future, boundaries of toleration, ways and means of getting to the future they prefer, and the sacrifices that they are prepared to make for each other. This sense of cohesion creates what I call the public. The public is not individualistic or collectivist, and it acknowledges and honors the individual. Indeed, one of the challenges that the public faces is the moral obligation to respect the minority, including the minority of one. The public is not a basket of smaller interest groups and stakeholder groups, each with a specific interest. The public is a complex living organism with a universal mandate that is constantly experiencing some tension as it oscillates between respect for the individual and respect for the whole. A democracy that values harmony and natural equality, it seems to me, must have a preference for inclusion. This preference for inclusion will have different boundaries from time to time and from place to place. The ancient Athenians did not include slaves and aliens in the government of their democracy. Canada today does not allow absolutely anyone to immigrate, and immigrants must live among us for 5 years. They must pass a citizenship test, and they must pledge loyalty to the Queen before they are granted citizenship. Generally speaking, a democracy will show a preference for inclusion rather than a predisposition toward exclusion. A preference for inclusion should also be a celebration of diversity rather than a way of imposing homogeneity. Organizational theory, genetics, and experience of nations demonstrates that diversity is to be preferred over homogeneity. Diverse communities tend to be healthier, more resilient, more adaptive, more creative and inventive, and longer lasting than monochromatic communities. Thailand, for example, is stronger because the people of Bangkok are joined with the people of the highlands, the people of the plains, the people of the Mekong River region, and the people of the Southern Peninsula. Which leads me to trust. Community, the public, inclusion, and diversity all point to the need for trust, which takes us back to the relational nature of humanity. We need trust. In order to have trust, we need to have relationships that are frequently active. We need to have interactions and experiences that enable us to build trust with each other. Trust is a matrix of assumptions that become convictions about the intentions, the will, the integrity, and the capacity of fellow citizens, our co-venturers. trust grows in ever wider circles. There cannot be trust at the national level in any nation if the many communities within the nation don't build trust within themselves and among themselves. The United States is experiencing a crisis of trust right now. Inclusion and the celebration of diversity, the acceptance of natural equality, and the search for harmony all suggest that a democracy should be a civil society rather than an ideological one. This has two different implications that merit comment. The term civil society suggests simply that we should treat each other civilly rather than coarsely or violently, especially when we disagree. In a civil society, people treat each other civilly. A civil society is certainly law-based, but it is also graciousness-based. In this regard, let me say a word about social norms. Actually, I'm not going to say a word about social norms because I would like to come to the second implication. A civil society is one in which much is accomplished informally in the community on the initiative of citizens. A civil society has a rich array of clubs, fraternities, societies, temples, cooperatives, and other non-government organizations that do good work on their own and join with other groups to do good work. Aside from the direct benefits that result from the work of civil society groups, an important indirect benefit is that citizens learn, practice, and fulfill the roles of leadership and followership. As part of this rich learning process, they also learn how to disagree while remaining civil with each other. They learn the importance of critical inquiry and appreciative inquiry. They learn the importance of having good and reasonably complete information. They can explore, promote, and practice diverse forms of dialogue and deliberation. Among other things, they learn what it means to respect the minority. Which brings us then to citizenship. In the Euro-American tradition, we have studied leadership extensively for more than 80 years. Our focus has deceived us. The fact of the matter is, no one is a leader without followers. Great disasters can be as much a failure of followership as they may be a failure of leadership. My experience leads me to the conclusion that to be a citizen is to be sometimes a leader and sometimes a follower. Even as Minister of Education in Alberta, I sometimes followed the lead of another who might be more imaginative than me about a certain problem or more experienced than me in dealing with certain circumstances, or who might have a more finely developed sense of what is right. In a democratic community, we all need to develop the skills of leadership. We also need to develop a fine sense of when it is wise to be a follower. And then we need the moral courage to be discerning and tough-minded followers. It seems plausible to me to argue that the great failure of Germany in the 30s, 35, was not only a failure of leadership, but also a failure of followership. The last consideration I want to leave with you is this. I would argue that a strong system of public education is vital to the well-being of any democracy. In addition, I argue that a public education is not truly public unless it has two characteristics that are only rarely discussed when the talk turns to public education. Public education is not public because it is funded by the government. It isn't funded because it isn't public because it is mandated by the government. It isn't a public education because there is a compulsory attendance law. What makes public education is this. It is first of all organized to be a deliberate and thoughtful model of a civil democratic system. Any system of public education should be inclusive, both as a matter of right and as a matter of responsibility. It should be inclusive from the classroom to the staff room to the representative assembly that points its course. There is a frequently quoted adage, perhaps from Africa, that it takes a whole village to raise a child. I agree. The implication then is that the whole village is responsible for the education of every child, and the entire village should be involved in the governance of the public school system. In other words, in a democracy, it is not enough for a public school system to have a program of studies and a curriculum. It must be a living model of a democracy, a place that is a community in its own way, and a community that models democracy as children experience interactions with teachers and others on the playground, in the hallway, or in the principal's office. Any system of public education should demonstrate inclusiveness by taking in refugees, the handicapped, or the children of those who are ostracized by the community. How can children grow up believing in the value of inclusion and the celebration of diversity if they are excluded from or educated in a system that is not inclusive and a celebration of democracy? Politics is always and everywhere. It need not be partisan or formal. It cannot be avoided, although we can choose to be unconscious about its working. At its simplest, politics is any process by which a group of people make and act on decisions about what they want to do and where and how. And in the background of every political decision is one more question: why? For example, a family gathering on an evening before a holiday is engaged in a political conversation as they talk about what they will do on the holiday. How much money and energy do they have, and should they spend it tomorrow or save it for something further in the future? Perhaps the day can be planned so that diverse interests can be met. Democracy is a complex and very fragile thing. There is no nation in the world that I know of that has yet got democracy right. We all quest to do a better job. And so I was surprised to learn about the existence of the Institute. My surprise may simply be an example of North American self-centeredness. I am not aware of the existence of any comparable organization in the Americas or in Europe. It is interesting, though, that both in Canada and in the United States, and perhaps in other institutions, the national governments have institutions that are devoted to encouraging the development of democracy, not in their own country, but in other countries. It is highly unusual and maybe unique to discover a national institution that was government-initiated and has a very focused object with a broad mandate to promote democracy within the country. This is a very significant institution, and I will certainly carry word of it back to Canada. My congratulations to all the people who labor on behalf of the Institute, as well as those whose support is vital to it. Democracy, as I said, is a fragile flower. There may be no place in the world that has practiced it well. Democracy depends upon a strong sense of the public, a public that feels a strong sense of social cohesion around an institution that clearly understands, ultimately, the best interests of the nation are the best interests of the public. Democracy is being strenuously tested at this time. This is certainly true in the United States and in Europe and in other places as well. There is no reason to believe that the Euro-American experience is the only route or the best route to democracy. Believing in democracy, Thais and many others have an opportunity to experiment, to learn from experience, and to make changes and show new and encouraging ways of being democratic. To everyone committed to this work, I wish you well. I would help however I can. Once again, my thanks to the Institute for the invitation. I am deeply grateful for the opportunity to converse with people who care as deeply about democracy as I do. Imagining and nurturing democracy into vibrant being is an exciting challenge. My condolences to the royal family and all the people of Thailand on the death of the king. You are in my prayers. Thank you.
ค่ะขอเสียงปรบมือให้กับมิสเตอร์เดวิดคิงอีกครั้งหนึ่งค่ะทางสถาบันพระปกเกล้าขอขอบพระคุณมิสเตอร์เดวิดคิงอดีตรัฐมนตรีว่าการกระทรวงศึกษาธิการจากรัฐอัลเบอร์ตาประเทศแคนาดาที่ได้มาแสดงปาฐกถานำในเวทีประชุมวิชาการสถาบันพระปกเกล้าในครั้งนี้อีกครั้งหนึ่งค่ะ